Two changes have made patch 16 absolutely unprecedented, the first of which being no flea market at the beginning for the first few weeks of the wipe, and the second one being find in raid required on items for using in Hideout modules. The ultimate result of this is that people had to store so much stuff that people have just had junk boxes literally everywhere and stashes full, no matter which edition of the game you're on. I myself had 6, I normally have 3, and one of those I end up putting into the scav case, so I end up usually using 2. But of all the different players, the edition that has been screwed the most by these changes are those players on standard accounts, because they are so limited. As the stash space gets smaller, the amount of things that you need to compromise on just only increases as you go through the game, as there is now a lot of stuff that you need later that you're trying to save now. And standard account people are having to get rid of stuff that they know they need later to save things that they need sooner than that, which is just a really crazy situation. And with this new kind of storage regime in general, if BSG are going to continue on with this type of theme, which I imagine they probably will do because it has been pretty well received based on the poll that we saw very recently saying that a lot of people actually did enjoy the experience of the beginning of the wipe without the flea, then it means that I think that some changes need to happen to the standard accounts for the game to actually become playable. Because right now I actually do think that the standard game on its own, as you purchase it out of the box without any additions or anything else, is probably kind of unplayable in the current format of the game at the beginning of a new wipe. There really are 3 things that make the standard account more challenging than the others. The first one being space, which is obvious. The second one being the secure container, because obviously you begin with the 2x2 alpha container rather than the higher editions, which end up with something a bit bigger up to EOD and Unheard, which have the 3x3 gamma, which has always been a big advantage. And then finally, you also have the extra trader rep that you get also from some of the bigger editions, which is 0.2 for EOD in particular, given that was a very, very popular version of the game, whereas for standard you start off literally with 0. This doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things, especially towards the end, but there are certain pinch points, especially around Jaeger, and it really does pull back the progression a lot for players who are on standard, and you have to farm a lot more quests in order to get to the same trader level as people on the other higher editions of the game. So first I want to have a look actually at the stash space thing itself. If you go on the actual Escape from Tarkov website, you can see here, this is the standard edition. You get the basic stash, which says 10 by 30. I'm actually not sure if it is exactly 10 by 30, because if you look at the wiki on here, it says owning the standard edition says 10 by 28. So I actually don't know which is right. I don't have a standard account to hand to check, but either way, it's very, very small. As you go up through the different editions, you go from 10 to 30, 10 to 40, 10 to 50, and then obviously Unheard with 10 by 72, which is by far the biggest version of the game. It's actually even bigger than EOD. Now you can counter this by, in the Hideout, you can upgrade to these different stash versions. So you have the beginning stash, you're not stuck with that because you can upgrade to stash level 2, which is recommended anyway. You basically have to do that if you're on standard because you can't get to nutrition 3 or workbench 3 without it. So you pretty much have to have this version. And now with find in raid for the Hideout, the cost for this stuff doesn't really matter as much. Obviously you still have to go and find those things, but it's not something that you actually have to pay for. You have to just find it in raid, and they're not actually too bad to find. These things are not terrible. 2.5 million rubles is quite a lot, given that this is about 2.5 scav junk boxes. This does impact a lot on people's progression early. These are the guys who probably do want to have more scav junk boxes than the other players, and having to spend it on stash 2 instead in order to progress. But this one isn't actually that horrible. Like, it could definitely be better, and I think it should be made cheaper, but I don't think it's actually that horrible. The worst ones are levels 3 and 4 stash, which is absolutely crazy. 8.5 million rubles for stash 3, along with 2 drills, a screws, pack of nails. This stuff is kind of by the by. Electric drills are a little bit hard to come by, but the rest of the stuff's not too bad. But 8.5 million rubles is a serious amount, especially considering you only get 10 more lines. So that's 100 stash space for 8.5 million. 8.5 million rubles is a lot. Until you get on later into the game, you have Bitcoin farm and all sorts of stuff, then it's not as much. But early on, these people are probably not going to get to the Bitcoin farm as fast as well because of the various restrictions that we've talked about. Finally, when you go up to stash level 4, 200,000 euros is nearly 33 million rubles. If you do a little bit of maths, you can see that for this money, it basically costs you 165,000 rubles for every individual square that you get. This has never been worth it. Stash 4 has never been worth the upgrade because you can buy items cases and thick items cases for less. Items cases right now cost roughly 1.8 million rubles to get, and they give you 64 slots. It is worth bearing in mind that they do take 16 slots in your stash, so it actually isn't as many as you think. It's only 48. So rather than being 28k per slot, it's actually 38k. However, this is much better than 165. A thick case costs about 13 million. Obviously, you need to get all the way up to the top trader levels to be able to buy this thing, and this gives you 196 slots. minus the 15 that it takes up in the stash, that's 181, and that ends up being 72,000 per slot. So it's still twice as good as doing stash level 4. Stash level 4 is so expensive, and it is way too much. And that's one of the first things that I really do think should change about the standard account to make it a little bit easier given the restrictions that we've got on the game these days. I think it's probably only going to continue going on this way. And as I said before about the polls, it looks like people like it. So we need to make these people's lives a little bit easier because the game has changed fundamentally. So the next point is about containers. We were looking at the Secure Container Alpha, which is a 2x2. It's not very much, and this is what you get when you start off as a standard, and it does make it very difficult to progress and play in this particular fashion. It doesn't really matter anymore for keeping hideout items in there because they need to be found in raid, but just in terms of taking enough medicine and ammo to not lose something every single time, it makes it a bit tricky. Now, I'm not suggesting that BSG just suddenly gives standard account players like a bigger case, but one of the earliest upgrades that standard guys are looking to do is the Secure Container Beta. Now this one, there is a barter for it, and it's always been relatively expensive. BSG have actually made this barter better over time, because back when I played on standard, it actually wasn't worth getting the beta container. You pretty much just did the Punisher questline to get the Epsilon container for free. But the thing about this barter now is that if you're trying to do this anywhere near the beginning of the wipe and there's no flea market, you have to find all of these items in raid yourself. Vertexes are really expensive when they come to the flea for about 2 million each, but if you're trying to actually find these items on your own, it's practically impossible. You really need the collective effort of the entire player base going to find these items and people to list them up on the flea market who don't actually need them for the beta container in order to realistically stand a chance of getting the parts for this. Finding 2 vertexes for Lend-Lease is difficult, even for experienced players. It does take a while, there's a lot of RNG involved, so finding 3 for this container, which, you know, in the pre-flea world, it effectively is hardcore in the sense that you have to find all that stuff yourself because there is no flea market in which to buy these things off other players, then it's just such a tall ask for most standard account players who often will be the players who are actually the least experienced in the game. Some people will stick to it because they like the grind, but a lot of people will be buying the game for the first time and trying to play on standard and having an expectation that the game will allow them to do so without buying extra stash lines or doing anything else. And I think that this beta container barter definitely needs to be reduced a lot. Even finding 1 individual vertex processor is a tall ask for most people. So I think that this just needs to be reconsidered completely. It's not like going from a 2 slot to a 6 slot is a dramatic change that's going to, you know, suddenly make everybody who's got the 3x3 slot containers mad. This is pretty much like barely enough to actually play the game adequately. At this point, with the 3 vertexes, I would genuinely say that it's easier for people to go and complete Punisher Part 6 than it is to try and get the beta container before the flea market opens. So I do think that this also needs to be looked at as well. A little extra addition while editing, I just remembered that I forgot to talk about the 1x1 CMS. I think there should be a 1x1 CMS in the game. This would really help standard account players as well with their small container. It could even be something like the med tools that exist in the game right now and gives you 1 usage to fix a black limb. Because currently the CMS, while good, is 2x1 and it really limits what you could do in the secure container. You don't necessarily need 5, but the ability to bring in 1 item that allows you to heal yourself 1 time for a black limb, or twice maybe, once or twice, I think that that would be a really good addition. Just a little note while I'm editing. The final suggestion that I have for BSG to actually make life easier for standard account players will end up benefiting everybody and is a nice quality of life thing that we have had in other parts of the game be added, but the hideout has kind of been neglected in some way, and that is partial hand-ins for the modules that you need to build still. So say that you need 15 bolts for a particular module to be built, for example, but you only have 7 of them found in raid. Well, it would allow you to turn those in. We have this for quests. This used to not be in place for quests and got added by BSG, so I think that they are probably capable of doing so to add this to the game, and that would actually really help to alleviate some of the space problems, because a lot of the modules take a lot of components, and if you could put those into the actual module itself ready waiting for it to be finished and built, then that's also going to alleviate some space issues for the standard account people and also be really nice quality of life for people from other editions as well, because there have been a couple of situations where I've ended up accidentally using stuff that I didn't need but I was holding it in reserve, but I ended up using it for a craft or whatever else, because it's so hard to keep track of everything now. It's even more complicated these days, and I'm a YouTuber with my entire deal being, you know, the information side of the game, and it's difficult even for me to track. So I really do think that they should add that as well to help alleviate some of these space problems and just have a nice convenient quality of life. Combining this with some of the changes to the stash and some changes to the containers as well, I do think would go a really long way to help standard account players actually enjoy the process a bit more, because people aren't going to want to play the early wipe if it is pure pain and misery. Sure, Tarkov is supposed to be a game about suffering, where you overcome adversity and challenge and then finally make your breakthrough, and when you succeed, the victory is ever more sweet. But if the initial grind is just so painful that you can't even get through it, like I do suspect is the case at the moment, then people are just simply not going to play. And so I think that the standard guys need to be on a little bit more of a level playing field with everybody else. You don't need to go nuts, but I really do think that they need to come through with some of these additions to make it better for them. Also, if BSG are targeting 1.0, you would imagine there's going to be a flurry of people who have heard about the game before all over the place for various reasons. It's, you know, infamous in terms of difficulty and the skill curve and everything else. And a lot of people will turn up into this find in raid flealess wipe, and I think we'll be shocked as to just how difficult the game is, because I think the game now is a lot harder than when I started. And yes, there are more resources to get better, but the experience of actually just trying to keep everything in your stash is part of the Tarkov experience, but we can alleviate that to improve everybody's life and just make it more fit for purpose for today's Tarkov. So I hope you enjoyed today's TED Talk. As usual, big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.